Committee meeting here at Kings Fork Middle School. We are going to review 5 policies this afternoon, and we're going to first review and approve the minutes from the July 6, 2021 meeting. So if you'll take a moment and review those minutes, we received them in an email, but if there are any last minute updates, you can take a moment and look over those. Do you see any questions other than the updates that are already noted? If not, I'll approve, as far as I'm concerned, the minutes.
Don't see any problem.
Do you see any problem? Okay. We'll approve these minutes as corrected, and we'll move on to we don't have any unfinished business, so we'll move on to the next section, which is new business. We're going to look at appointment of the purchasing manager. That's the first policy that we're looking at, policy 4-6.2, appointment of the purchasing manager and duties of the school superintendent, spot purchases by employees. We have one change in the language. Any contract entered into and/or bid awarded by the superintendent must not exceed funds available in the school board's adopted budget in any fund or category. That is the only change to that particular policy. And instead of the school board, we have Suffolk Public Schools. That's the first substitution. Instead of agent, we have manager. So those are our notations in the language. The policy has not changed, or has it, Mr. Wong?
Yes, Madam Chair. The main change in this policy pertains to limiting the superintendent's authority in granting or approving contracts. You might recall that in your board meeting in October of 2020, you authorized the superintendent to execute contracts on behalf of the school board. What this revision does is that it now places a limit on the authority of the superintendent in executing those contracts, that the superintendent cannot execute a contract that will exceed those funds that's in the approved budget in either any fund or in any category. So basically what it has done is that it has placed a limit on the superintendent's exercise of the authority that the board has given them.
Okay. And I remember before, at least I'm thinking, I remember before we had an amount limit on how far he could go when we gave him that opportunity. Didn't we have an amount that he was limited to? We did so because of COVID, and we didn't know what the circumstances were going to be with regard to meetings. I remember that. But I thought there was an amount placed on it. That's a question that doesn't have anything to do with this. I just remembered that. But this is fine as far as I'm concerned. This is what I saw. Ms. Byram, did you have any questions or concerns about this?
So really the basic thing is we're changing the purchasing agent to a manager.
Right, that's the current terminology that's used. Instead of referring to the person as the purchasing manager, the terminology is the purchasing agent.
Right. And so the second thing is, instead of for consideration or approval by the school board, the superintendent is authorized to use whatever funds are in the category that we've already approved in the approved budget. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So for instance, if we said you can spend $10,000 on furniture, he can do that without coming back to the board to get approval for something that's $10,000 or under. if that's what's on the line item on the budget.
That's
Is that
correct. If there's a
Okay.
line item already set aside in the budget for a particular item with a dollar amount attached to it, he can now, of course, spend up to that amount in that approved line item, or if it's in a category, because
Right.
oftentimes you have things that are grouped in a category.
Right.
And as long as he stays within that category in terms of the expenditure, this policy will allow him to do that.
Right. So if he were purchasing technology and we had money in computers and we needed printers, he'd have some flexibility with what he needed to buy
Correct.
without coming back to board. I understand. I don't have any more questions. Do you? Okay. Okay. I think we can move forward with that to the first reading by board members. Okay. The second one is placement on the salary scale. And so as I understand, we have changed some language in it. The changes that I see are the employee can instead of cannot. The employee can be credited on the appropriate salary scale. And these are employees. This is policy, section 7-16, 5.1. And this is placement on a salary scale, credit for teaching experience, credit for work experience, credit for military experience, reserve military experience not included, and superintendent to develop regulations. So this is under C1 and C2. I see changes under C2 and under D. Is that correct? Am I in the right place? Right channel?
Yes, you are.
Okay, area 2, item 2 under C, and then D has been added. So that would read, can be given credit on the appropriate salary scale for any such full-time related work experience. And that is full-time work related experience, credit for teaching, credit for work experience, credit for military experience. And that credit can be or will be determined by the superintendent if there's any question. Is the superintendent to develop regulations with regard to how we do this?
Yeah, this is a policy change that was recommended by the Human Resource Department. And the reason was to try to make Suffolk Public Schools more competitive in terms of hiring and
Correct.
giving people credit for full-time work relevant experience. And it does two things. One, it addresses non-military people.
Right.
Because at first there was a cap, a 7-year experience that people could be given. They could not be given more than 7 years full-time related work experience.
Okay.
This removes the 7-year cap. So if
Okay.
a person is hired, and let's say the person has 15 years of full-time related work experience, they can now get the benefit of the full 15 years of prior work experience.
Okay. So
Whereas
if it were
before,
somebody
they would
like
only
me,
get up to 7.
right. So for somebody like me who moved as a military wife and I came back here with 20 years of experience as a teacher, then I could still be considered for that here in this system? Is that
Correct.
correct? Okay.
Correct.
And there'd be no limit
Whereas
on?
currently, without this policy change, that person would only get 7 years.
I see.
And so by removing the 7-year cap, it will make Suffolk Public Schools more competitive, especially with regard to veteran teachers or veteran support personnel and what have you. So that's one of the major changes to this proposed policy change. The other relates to military people. With regard to people in the military, there was also a cap.
Okay.
They could get up to 4 years for their military experience.
Yeah, that's,
And that was basically it.
mhm.
Now what happens is that they can get up to 4 years of military experience, and then in addition to that, if they have some full-time relevant work experience in the military, they can also get credit for that as well.
Okay.
So let's say someone was had held an administrative assistant position in the military.
Okay,
They would get the 4 years for military service, and then let's say they were in the military in that position for 10 years. They would then get the additional 6 years for the relevant work experience.
okay. So if they were an officer, say in the military, which is equivalent to our administrators, and they were responsible for, well, officers are often responsible for hundreds of thousands of people, but say if they were an officer in the military, they could come back and get experience. Is there a formula we'd use for that, or is that what the superintendent will develop and the staff
That
will
would
develop?
be determined by perhaps regulations or guidelines by the superintendent. Ultimately, HR will determine whether or not, number one, it's considered to be relevant full-time work experience, and then number two, how much of that time they should be given.
Okay,
The main thing to keep important about this policy change is that it allows military people to get full-time work credit experience, which was something they could not get previously. They were
Before.
only getting up to the 4 years of military time
I see.
and nothing beyond that.
Nothing beyond it. So if we got a plumber, say somebody who was a plumber, or who was an auto mechanic, or who did any kind of work like that, HVAC stuff, and that's what they did in the military, then they could have that experience credited when they came to us. We'd look at that experience that they had, and they could get that experience credited when they came to us.
Correct, and I think that's a good example. Someone who may have been a plumber, let's say, or an electrician in the military. They would get those years of time in the military, plus any additional work-related experience that they may have had while they were there. And this will clearly make positions and in hiring more attractive for people that have experience in various areas.
So this is going to broaden our market, open up our market for employees, especially in this area. Give us a broader base of employees, of a supply to draw from when we're looking for employees.
Would this apply to all career switchers or just the military?
Well, it would apply because the policy talks about
Credit for work experience.
support positions. So it would be anyone that's in a non-teaching
Right.
position.
So if we had someone come in, I know, for instance, years ago, we had several people we got from research facilities who were in science, and they came to be chemistry teachers. And so if they had experience in industry, so to speak, they could get some credit for that.
Yeah, now, I don't know how HR deals with teachers and giving teachers credit for prior work experience like you have described, but the policy specifies support
Right.
personnel.
It's not instructional personnel.
It
'cause they
doesn't
usually-
mention instructional. So I don't know if they do something similar for instructional people, and they may very well.
And I would think that they would have to go back and make sure they get qualified through the state, because they'd have to get state licensure, and they'd have to be on some kind of probationary status until they were able to qualify for licensure, I would think. I don't know. If they were in instructional positions. Okay. Do you have any more questions?
No.
Okay, all right, and we can move that one on for the first reading. The next policy is section 9-11.6, and that is portable communication devices permitted use in the classroom, superintendent to develop regulations. this is one that I know we had a lot of conversation about several years ago, and we decided that it could be used for instruction. But of course, over the years, we have had these devices used for a lot of things that were not instructional. So this is, we permit students enrolled in Suffolk Public Schools during the school day portable communication technology devices, and they will include but not be limited to cell phones, smartphones, tablets, e-readers, smartwatches, and laptops. And then B, these are changes, recognizing that certain electronic devices may not be appropriate for instruction. Portable communication technology devices will only be considered for classroom use if they are mobile and have the capability of browsing the internet. Whether a device is appropriate to connect to Suffolk Public Schools network will be made by Suffolk Public Schools Technology Department, and the decision will be final. And then under C, the school superintendent is hereby authorized to develop regulations for further implementation of this policy.
As we all are aware, portable communication devices are now allowed in Suffolk Public Schools, and students have them all the time. So this policy pretty much now aligns with your practice.
Right.
Because the old policy actually prohibited portable communication devices in your schools. So now the policy aligns with what the current practice is. It also carves out 2 requirements in order for that communication device to be utilized in the classroom setting. And one of those is that in order for it to be considered for classroom instruction, it must be able to browse the internet. That's number 1. And then number 2, it must be able to connect to Suffolk Public Schools network. So if those 2 requirements cannot be met, that portable communication device cannot be used in the classroom setting.
Okay. Now, these are to the exclusion of any special devices by students who use assistive technology, because we have some students with disabilities who use assistive technology. So we're not talking about those things here. We're just talking about the things that we bring from home. That
Right,
students
these
would
are
bring
things
from
that
home.
students will bring into the school from home. These are private devices.
Private devices.
And not school-provided devices that are maybe used for a student in a special needs class that has some assistive technology. This would not address that.
Now, I think one of the things I know, one of the concerns I expressed was, and it may be in something else, I know it's not in this set and we're not reviewing all of the policies, but my concern is the use of these devices to post things. I know there are consequences we're using now for students who post activities that are not supposed to be taking place in school. And I had hoped to see something in our policy, but I don't see that. So I'm wondering if this is the place or if there's something else there. Because my concern was that students who are posting fights and posting inappropriate things on the internet, obviously they have the ability to do that because they're posting those things as they are happening and passing those things around. And while they have the use of the technology, and of course, as we do the procedures or as these are developed, I'll be interested in knowing, without the force of policy, I'd like to see them, and this is just my opinion, I'd like to see them enforced all over the school when we allow students to bring these things. What are the consequences for inappropriate use of these devices?
I believe there is a recent regulation, and I'll double check that for you. But I think there's a recent regulation by the superintendent that now prohibits taking pictures and videoing certain things while at school, such as fights and things of that nature. But I'll double check that, and I'll send something out to you all. But I'm almost certain that there is something now.
I know that he put in place, that Dr. Gordon put in place a procedure, a regulation that we use. I was just wondering, would it be appropriate, or would it be necessary? Or, I don't know, Ms. Brown, what are your thoughts with regard
Well,
to
In this
enforcement?
particular policy, it mentions that the school superintendent will be authorized to develop regulations for further implementation. So is he planning to develop
To augment
something later to show us what's actually going to be included? I mean, to regulate other things like we're talking about.
I have not had that conversation with him, so I don't know. But I'm sure that since with the adoption of this, that he will have the authority to develop regulations.
Right.
That if he feels that there is a need for a specific regulation to address a specific issue that's happening within the buildings, I'm sure that he'll do that.
Right.
Because, and the reason that I'm asking, because I see that as a further extension of bullying. If someone is fighting and then you're posting, usually it's whoever the students perceived was the winner, you're trying to embarrass the student who was involved in the fight. And so it's posted on the fight, and it seems like bullying is extended with this whole thing. So I don't know whether it would be, I know that in my conversation with Dr. Gordon with regard to this, there is a consequence, and the consequence is you'll get the same thing. I just need to know if that's something that we need to do in the policy, or if the policy then will cover whatever regulations are developed, that he develops.
And it may very well be covered in the Code of Student Conduct. That's where I'm thinking right now we may have placed some language about videotaping, but I'll double check that.
Okay. And I'm sure we'll have time as this would go forward for a first reading. Do you have any other questions?
No.
Okay. Our next policy is administering medications or medicines, section 9-20.11:1. This is prescription medications, non-prescription medications, self-administration of medications, sharing, borrowing, etc. of medication prohibited, self-administration of asthma medication and auto-injectable epinephrine, school nurse trained in administration of epinephrine, ordered and trained administration of stock albuterol, superintendent to develop regulations. So the only things that I've seen are here, in ordered and trained administration of stock albuterol, and that's at the beginning, and in sections G and H are additions. And those additions in section G, employee of a local appropriating body or employee of a local health department. And that's with regard to, I'll read the whole sentence so it makes sense. Pursuant to an order of standing protocol issued by the carrier within the course of the school nurse professional practice assurance, a school nurse or any school board employee of a local appropriating body or employee of a local health department who is authorized and trained in the administration of epinephrine may possess epinephrine and administer it to any student believed to be having an anaphylactic reaction. That's the first addition or amendment to this in section H. And then in section G, and in section 8, pursuant to an order of standing protocol that shall be issued by the prescriber within the course of his professional practice, any school nurse or school board employee who is authorized and trained in the administration of albuterol inhalers and valve holding chambers or nebulized albuterol may possess or administer an albuterol inhaler and a valve holding chamber or nebulized albuterol to a student diagnosed with a condition requiring an albuterol inhaler or nebulized albuterol when the student is believed to be experiencing or about to experience an asthmatic crisis. And those are the changes. These are additions. And I think there's one other change in item F, just from activities, sponsored activity to activities. So it's just a change from singular to plural in that section. Any questions?
The school board policy already allowed for those, for the school nurse or any school employee that is trained to administer epinephrine to do so. This expands it to albuterol
Okay.
for those students that may have an asthmatic crisis and is in need of an inhaler. Now, the school nurse or the trained school employee, consistent with medical orders, could provide that albuterol to the student who's in a crisis because of an asthmatic attack.
Okay. I don't have
And I think it's important to mention that the person has to be both authorized and trained.
And trained.
So you just can't have anybody doing it.
Right.
And then the other saving mechanism to this, to ensure that it's being done properly, is that it has to be by order, by physician order.
Right.
So
The
it has to be
prescription
prescribed
has to be
medication.
on the, and, you know, it's been a while since I was a principal, but the medication that we had at school had to come directly from the physician. It could not have rewritten orders on the outside tape to. We had to give it just like the prescription from the drugstore said. Nobody could change that, so I'm assuming that is what we're talking about. Whatever is on the bottle that it says, if it says 1 pill, you have to give 1 pill. If it says 2 pills, you have to give 2 pills. If it says 2 puffs, that's all you get is the 2 puffs.
That's right, that's
Okay.
right, because that would be following the physician order, the medical directive that's been given by the medical care
That
professional.
came with the prescription. Okay. All right. You have any questions, Ms. Brown?
No.
Okay, we can pass that on for first reading. And the last one is our favorite, the Virginia Freedom of Information Act. The Virginia Freedom of Information Act, this is section 10-3.5. Not required to create a public record, penalties for altering or destroying public records, school FOIA officer training required. The change that I see is section B. Suffolk Public Schools is not required to create a new record if the record does not already exist. However, Suffolk Public Schools may abstract or summarize information under such terms and conditions as agreed between the requester and Suffolk Public Schools. Public records maintained by Suffolk Public Schools in an electronic data processing system, computer database, or any other structured collection of data will be made available to a requester at a reasonable cost, not to exceed the actual cost in accessing, duplicating, supplying, or searching for the requested records. That's the only addition to the,
And this policy change mirrors what's in the Virginia Freedom of Information Act as it relates to public records.
okay,
The act spells out that a public body is not required to create a record that does not already exist. And so this explains that in our own policy, that we will not create a public record if it does not already exist. Also, it spells out that we can abstract or summarize information. But again, that is permissible, not required.
okay,
So, if the record doesn't exist and we cannot reach an agreement with the requester to summarize information, we don't have to do that.
Okay.
And then the last part of this revision to the policy pertains to reasonable costs that will be charged to those who request a public record. And again, this mirrors the language found in the
In the law.
Virginia Freedom of Information Act. Oftentimes, people are under the mistaken belief that if a record is in a data form, if it's in an electronic form, and they request it in an electronic form, that there should be no cost attached to that. But there still may be the cost to research,
Right.
the cost to supply it. And so all of that can still be taken into account. And so just because they're requesting it in an electronic form or format does not mean that there will not be any cost attached to it.
Right. It suggests that sometimes people think that you could just forward it to them in an email from its original source, that you can just click it on, it comes up, and you forward it to them in an email. And I think that's a misnomer. I really do. I think it's a misrepresentation of how easy things are to find and how easy this work is to do. And then when you have to redact things as well while you're doing this, I don't think people understand that when you go through these things, when they request things, there's some information, depending on what they've requested, that has to be redacted, so that takes time. And I don't know that people understand that's the cost associated with it. And taking the employees' time from the job that they have to do to get this information. One of the things that we try to make clear whenever I talk to our local or state or federal funders, I remind them that we operate at 1.98, I believe it is, % of our staff is administrative, which means we are below the average in this area and a place else, because more people have more administrators than that for the size workforce that we have. And I don't think that quite gets over as it should, but this takes a while. So I'm glad that this is there, and I think it is most appropriate. Did you have any questions or comments, Ms. Bass?
So when you ask for an item to be forwarded, the reasonable cost of it, how is that determined?
Well, the way that we do it, the way the administration handles the reasonable cost, it looks at the amount of time that it takes the individual to search for the record. And then based on the amount of time it takes that individual times whatever their hourly rate is how we determine the search time. If there is copying that's involved, we charge them whatever the copying cost is. If there is, if redactions have to be done, we will then charge them the time associated with the redactions. And oftentimes, there are more than one person involved in the process. There may be one person that actually searches to pull the records. There is someone else that may do the actual redacting of the records. And so what they will get is an invoice that really shows the breakdown. The invoice will show search time. It will also show supply time, which would include the redaction time. And it will put a cost for each of those elements. Then there's a total. And that is the amount that they're required to pay.
I think that's a misunderstanding, like Dr. Buck said. Some people think you just hit a button and it flies to you. And it's not that simple. And with us only having, as she said, 1.99 or whatever that percentage is of delegated to administration, it pulls everybody away from their ordinary jobs. And people need to realize that it is, that's why it costs something.
Right.
You know,
Right.
and the cost, people don't understand the cost if they try to FOIA something. They think they're supposed to receive it like that. And, you know, it does take our employees a lot of time to do this and pulls a lot of people, like you said, not just one person, but maybe 4 or 5 people have to work on this job until it's completed. And then I think sometimes people think it's instantaneous, but it may take a couple of days or even a week to get all the information together, I would think, right?
It does. And in fact, under the statute, we have 5 work days in order to provide the public record. And if we cannot do it within the 5 workday period, we can request an additional 7 work days
Right.
in order to provide the information. And so, and there are times where we do have to request the additional days because we just can't do it within the 5 workday period. And whenever we request the additional days, we also have to provide them with the reason why we can't comply within 5 days. And we have to do that on occasion. Because again, it pulls people away from what their normal day-to-day responsibilities are. And especially depending on the time of the year that it comes in. For example, if we get a request for a public record that involves financial information, and it happens to hit at the same time budget is being prepared, that's going to mean that we're going to have to sacrifice some budget preparation time in order to pull together this public record.
Right.
Right.
And I don't think that people oftentimes understand how it can pose an issue for the school division to respond to some of these record requests, and especially when we have so many of them coming in one after another. And sometimes they're asking for duplicate information. And that's the other thing that gets real frustrating at times because it may be the same request. But we can't say to them, we've already given that to so-and-so, you need to check with them. We've also got to respond to them as well.
I see.
And so that is a duplication of effort.
One
We've
of-
got to do it again.
One of the things that concerned me, and of course, we've all taken the FOIA training several times, but I just took it an extra time, and one of the questions that came to mind, and one that I got a chance to ask, and of course, the advice was just let them do it, but it seemed that if something is already available and online, and all you have to do, you don't have to FOIA it. Say, if someone wants to FOIA our CARES Act expenditures, you can go to our budget. You can go to our budget and click on CARES Act and see how we spend every penny. That does not have to be FOIA. So, you know, the advice was just treat it like a FOIA request and send it, but it just seems that if it's already there, I can send you a link. Now, reasonable people I can usually talk to and say, here's the link, push the button. Don't spend your money on copies that you don't need because it's cheaper for you to just get some ink and copy it in your own printer rather than having us copy it for you and then you get charged for all the stuff. But has there been any discussion? I know I've talked to some legislators about that because it just seems to be a waste of money when people can have access to it. It's a waste of money and a waste of time, in my opinion, if you have access to it. Now, if you don't have the internet, that's a whole different thing, because we have people who don't have that, and I have no problems with that. But if you have access to the internet, it would seem that we would be able to say you have access to the internet, go there, and just click on the button. It's available to you.
We have responded to some record requests that involves information that is online, where we have simply provided them with the link. And you know, that's certainly a way that we can provide them with the record. we simply copy the link, and then we insert the link into the email back to them and say, this is where you can find that record that you're requesting. That's nice when we can do that, because of course it saves everyone time.
Right.
Um,
And the
But
people get the
we can't always
information
do
that
it
they
that
want.
way.
You know, if it's something that's available, it would seem to me if you really want this information and it's already available online, that would be the best way to handle it, rather than coming in
And I guess you would be a little surprised at the number of people that request information that may not be aware that the information is already available online.
Well, if you've been told that somebody's hiding something, you probably wouldn't look for it online, on your website. So, you know, you have to go with the misinformation campaign that has been rigorous. And so a lot of times people have been misinformed and don't know. Because I know I've told parents things like, they said, you know, we're dropping off children at school and they're worried about whatever. And I said, you know, we have 100% busing. I didn't know I could do that. And I'm thinking, okay, maybe you didn't, maybe you moved from somewhere else, maybe you didn't know, but you can. And so just giving them that information sometimes is good. And if they respond that way when you've sent it out, if enough people respond that way and know that we're not trying to hide anything, I think it's that whole stigma of misinformation that makes people afraid to look to see that this is available. But I'm glad that this is here, and I have no problem with sending this with the addition for first reading. Do you?
No.
Okay.
But I do hope, like Mr. Wallace said, the public understands what reasonable cost and how we go about doing that, because I've had questions on that. And I see Ms. Davenport shaking her head. I know she has worked often, you know, been pulled away from her job to work on things like this. I know that happens, you know, and we're understaffed in many areas for the size of our operation, and the public doesn't understand that. But I think, you know, we need to clarify as much as we can when we're in public about that.
That our whole legal team is sitting here?
Right. That's right.
Okay.
Say that again, Dr. Buck.
Our whole legal team is sitting here. Okay.
Two people, the legal team.
That's
Right.
exactly right.
And
That's exactly right.
there's a lot going on besides a FOIA request.
For 14,000 students and 2,300 employees. Our
That's
whole legal
exactly
team is
right.
sitting here.
And like you said, when they come to the finance department for a record, at certain times of the year, they're really understaffed because they're working on budget. They don't have time to stop and do all these other little things. It really pulls from the time that they need to be on their job that they were hired for. You know.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And like I said, understanding that we have a small administrative team. When I look at our whole technology staff, you know, how close we can fit together if we all come together, because it's a small group of people. And I think that oftentimes people think that there's some huge network of people doing all of the things that we do. And we just need to, as I've said over the years, get our story out. I think it would help a great deal. But that's the last one. Now, are there any concerns that you have before we look at our calendars and see if there's, when is our next scheduled meeting? Because this was an extra one, but when is our next scheduled? Do we know? If you don't, it's okay. We can.
So we'll have the next one should be between April and June. So sometime between now and June, we'll have another policy review committee meeting.
Okay.
And you should be getting, between now and then, the book
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
with the policy, suggested policy changes.
Okay.
Also, if there are some areas that you would like for policies to be considered for, please let us know that. And we will certainly look into the possibility of drafting something for you to consider. Because I'm sure that there are times where things happen, and after it has occurred, you start wondering, maybe we need a policy to address that. And so if that should come across your mind, and you should think that there is a need for a policy to address a specific area or a specific need, please let us know that, and we'll work on trying to put one together.
And the book that you're referring to is the book that we will get that updates a lot of the state policies.
That's correct.
See, a lot of people have a misconception about that we're getting updates all the time, that you have to change. We don't stay, I mean, it's a working document, right?
Right.
A living document, right?
And the reason that you get that book with all of the suggested policy changes is because changes are made in the state statute, in the Code of Virginia, that impacts what you do as a school board. And because of those changes at the state level, you have to bring your policy
In line.
with what has happened. And that's why you get those updates. That's why you get those revisions.
Thank you. And thank you guys so much for this. We do appreciate it. And if there are no other items we have to review, we may indeed adjourn this session. Thank you, Mr. Littlefield. We are done.